The morning Luke Donovan rode into Colburn Creek with 3 cents in his pocket, a saddle held together by prayer, and nothing but the clothes on his back and the hollow ache of a man who had run out of road. He had no idea that a woman he had never met was about to change the entire course of his life. The town of Colburn Creek sat like a stubborn old man on the eastern edge of the Texas Panhandle, refusing to die no matter how hard the wind and the drought and the years tried to push it into the earth. It was 1882, and the great cattle drives were still moving through that part of the country, stirring up dust and commerce and the occasional gunfight, though the railroad had begun to creep closer, and every rancher with a lick of sense knew the open trail days were numbered. The town itself was modest, maybe 400 souls on a good census day, with a main street that had a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a small church with a crooked steeple, a telegraph office that still surprised the older residents whenever it actually worked, and a post office that doubled as a gossip exchange for the entire county. Luke had come from nowhere in particular and was heading nowhere specific. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of ranch work, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ears when the weather was humid, and eyes the color of weathered copper that tended to study things longer than most people were comfortable with. He had spent the last decade drifting from ranch to ranch across New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas, working cattle and fences, and whatever else needed doing until the work ran out or he did something that didn't sit right with whoever was paying him. He was not a bad man. He had never been a bad man. But he had a habit of speaking plainly when dishonesty was expected, and that particular habit had cost him more than a few jobs. The last one had been on a spread near Amarillo, where the foreman had been skimming from the hands' wages and expected everyone to look the other way. Luke had not looked the other way. He had walked into the ranch owner's house on a Sunday morning and laid the matter out plainly. The owner had thanked him and fired him anyway, because the foreman was his brother-in-law, and that particular truth was too expensive to act on. Luke had ridden out with what little he was owed and had been moving east ever since, not because east held anything promising, but because going east meant going somewhere. He tied his horse, a rawbone roan mare named Pella, to the post outside the livery and walked the length of the main street with the careful eyes of a man who had learned to read towns the same way a sailor reads weather. Colburn Creek felt tired but not dead. The general store had fresh paint on the shutters. The church had a new bell. A handful of children chased a dog between the buildings, while their mothers watched from the shade of the hardware store's overhang. There was commerce here, modest but real, and that meant there was usually work. He went into the saloon first, not for drinking, because 3 cents bought nothing worth drinking, but because saloons were where news traveled fastest. The Red Lantern was dim and smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the barman was a squat fellow named Hatch who had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from a piece of disagreeable wood. Luke ordered nothing, which earned him a look, and asked if anyone in town was hiring. Hatch polished a glass that had probably been polished 100 times before and squinted. Depends on the work. Cowhand. Cowhand, fence work, carpentry, irrigation, loading, unloading, whatever needs doing. The barman tilted his chin toward the window. Ralston Place is about 4 miles south of town, down the Fork Road. Woman runs it alone since her father died last spring. Word is she is behind on about everything you can be behind on, but she doesn't have much money to offer. Luke nodded. I appreciate the information. He walked back to Pella, gave her a drink from the trough, and rode south. The Fork Road was aptly named. It split into 2 rough paths about a mile outside of town, one heading toward the river bottoms and one climbing into the low hills, and the Ralston property sat in the crook between them. As Luke came over a rise, he could see the spread below him, and it told a story as plain as any book. The house was a good-sized timber frame structure, solid in its bones but needing attention. One shutter hung by a single hinge. The barn roof had patches where the weather had won arguments with the shingles. The fencing along the western pasture was down in at least 2 places he could see from the road, and the cattle, maybe 60 head of decent-looking stock, had wandered into a corner of the property where they didn't belong, bunching up against a broken gate that someone had tried to prop shut with a fence post. There was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that was doing its best despite the July heat, and a clothesline hung with fresh laundry that snapped in the dry Texas wind. Someone was working here. Someone had planted and watered and washed. But one set of hands was not enough for a spread this size, and the evidence of that shortage was written across the property like a letter that could not be ignored. He rode down the slope and into the yard, and had barely dismounted when the front door opened, and Georgia Ralston came out. She was 25 years old, tall for a woman of her time, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that she wore the way practical women wore hats, not for style but for shade. She had green eyes, sharp and direct, the kind that made people feel they were being assessed whether they wanted to be or not. Her dress was plain calico, faded from sun and washing, and her hands, he noticed when she folded her arms, were not soft. She had a rifle on her back, carried as naturally as most women carried a shawl, and her expression when she looked at him was the careful expression of a woman who had learned that strangers on her property usually meant either trouble or disappointment. "Can I help you?" she said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that made clear she was not inviting familiarity. Luke took off his hat. "Name is Luke Donovan. I am passing through Colburn Creek and I heard you might be in need of some hired help. I am an experienced hand. Cattle, fencing, carpentry, irrigation. I can look at your roof and your barn and your western fence if you like and tell you what I think." She looked at him steadily. "I heard the word passing through. That means you are not staying." "I did not say that. I said I am passing through Colburn Creek. I did not say I was in a hurry to go anywhere in particular." She considered him. "What are your wages?" He paused just a beat. "I am not asking for wages, ma'am." She blinked. It was the first crack in her composure. "I beg your pardon." "I am broke," he said simply, because he had never seen any use in dressing up a straightforward truth. "I have 3 cents, a horse, and the skills I mentioned. I am not in a position to demand wages. What I would ask for is a place to sleep, a meal twice a day, and the use of your barn for Pella here. In exchange, I will work from first light to last light and I will not leave a job half done." Georgia Ralston looked at him for a long time. She looked at his horse, which was lean but healthy, which told her something about a man's character. She looked at his hands, which were calloused and capable. She looked at the way he held his hat, which was respectfully, and she looked at his eyes, which were steady and gave her nothing evasive to grab onto. "Fine," she said. She said it quietly, but she meant it entirely, and Luke Donovan stepped onto the Ralston property and into the rest of his life. She showed him the barn first, indicating the corner stall where Pella could be housed. It was clean, and that told him something about her, that even in the middle of too much work and too little help, she kept her barn clean. She walked him through the yard and pointed out the most pressing problems with the efficiency of someone who had been cataloging disasters in her head for months and was almost relieved to say them aloud. "The west fence is down in 3 places. I have been moving the cattle to the south pasture to compensate, but the grazing is thinner there. The barn roof needs 4 new sections at minimum. The well rope broke last week, and I have been carrying water from the creek every morning, which takes 2 hours. The smokehouse door is warped and will not seal, which means I cannot properly cure anything. And the irrigation ditch along the east side of the garden has silted up, and I need to dig it out before the squash dies." She delivered this list with a kind of grim practicality that made it clear she was not complaining. She was simply telling him the situation. "Which would you like me to start with?" he asked. "The well rope," she said without hesitation. "Everything else I can manage around. 2 hours of water carrying every morning I cannot." He fixed the well rope that afternoon, and it took him less than an hour. He used a length of strong rope from the barn, properly knotted to the existing mechanism, tested the draw, and lowered and raised the bucket a dozen times to make sure the splice would hold. When he walked back to the house and told her it was done, she went out and tried it herself, drawing water up smoothly and cleanly, and the expression that crossed her face was so quiet and so grateful that it hit him somewhere he had not expected. "Thank you," she said. "That was the easy one," he said. "The fence will take 2 days, the roof will take 3 if the weather holds." She nodded. "Supper is at 7 o'clock. I eat at the kitchen table. You are welcome to eat there as well." She said it simply, not warmly but not coldly either, and he understood that she was drawing the terms of a practical arrangement and not offering him anything beyond those terms. He respected that. He went back to work. Supper that first night was salt pork, cornbread, and boiled greens from the garden, and it was the best meal Luke had eaten in 3 weeks. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and they spoke sparingly, the way 2 people do when they are still measuring each other. She asked where he was from, and he told her he had grown up in Arkansas but had left at 16, which was true. He did not elaborate and she did not press. He asked how long she had been running the property alone, and she said since March, when her father, James Ralston, had passed from a fever that had taken him in less than a week. There was a brief, controlled pause after she said this, and Luke understood that she was not someone who let her grief sit where strangers could see it clearly, and he did not press on that either. She told him the history of the place in practical terms. Her father had bought the land in 1868, after the war, with money he had saved and borrowed and sweated out of a dozen different kinds of hard work. He had run a modest cattle operation, never large but profitable enough, and had raised Georgia more or less alone after her mother died of cholera when Georgia was 11. There had been hired hands in better years, but the drought of 1880 had hurt the operation badly, and then her father's health had begun to fail, and the help had trickled away as the money tightened. By the time James Ralston died in March of 1882, the spread was mortgaged to a bank in Colburn Creek, and Georgia had approximately 4 months to bring in enough from the fall sale of cattle to make the payment or lose the land entirely. She told him this the same way she had told him about the fence and the roof, as facts, not as a plea. "How short are you?" he asked. She looked at him across the table with those green eyes. "Short enough that every day of work that does not happen is a problem." He nodded. "Then we should sleep and get an early start." He slept in the barn on a cot he found folded against the wall, under a blanket that smelled of horses and cedar, and he lay awake for a while looking at the rafters and thinking about what he had gotten himself into. The thought was not unpleasant. It had been a long time since anything had felt like it mattered, and there was something about a piece of land with a fight in it, and a woman who was not going to beg for anyone's help, that made the bones of a purpose begin to assemble themselves inside his chest, where there had been a blank space before. He was up before dawn, and when he came out of the barn Georgia was already in the kitchen garden with a lantern and a hoe, working the soil around the base of the tomato plants in the early gray light. She looked up when she heard him come out. "Coffee on the stove," she said. He poured himself a cup black from the pot she had left and brought one out to her, setting it on the fence post nearest her without making a ceremony of it, and went to start on the fence. The days settled into a rhythm. Luke was methodical and thorough, the way men are when they are building towards something rather than just filling time. He fixed the west fence, resetting posts and stretching new wire he purchased in town against the small amount of cash Georgia had put aside for materials. He did not waste a cent of it. He then turned to the barn roof and worked with careful attention to the structure, replacing the rotted boards and laying new shingles in clean overlapping rows that would turn weather for a decade. He dug out the irrigation ditch in a single long afternoon, shoveling the packed silt while sweat soaked through his shirt, and by evening the water was moving cleanly along the channel, and the squash plants straightened up almost visibly by the next morning. Georgia watched all of this without watching it openly. She was too busy to stand around observing, but she noticed everything. She noticed that he did not do half a job anywhere. She noticed that he cared for Pella with the same attention he gave the work, checking her hooves every evening and keeping her stall clean. She noticed that he said please and thank you with an ease that suggested it was genuine rather than performed. And she noticed, on the fourth day, when the 6-year-old boy from the neighboring Harper property came running through the broken bit of fence near the creek to report that his collie dog had fallen into an old wash gully and could not get out, that Luke put down the hammer he was holding and went with the boy without a word of hesitation, and spent the better part of an hour lying flat in the dirt working the frightened animal up and out of the narrow space, and came back with mud on his face and a scratch on his forearm, and said nothing about it except to ask if there was something he could put on the fence gap to keep the boy from falling in himself. She did not say anything that evening at supper, but the way she poured his coffee was different. It was the difference between a woman performing a practical courtesy and a woman who was beginning to mean it. The trouble arrived on a Thursday, 10 days into Luke's time at the Ralston place, in the form of a man named Cord Beale. Beale was the land agent for the Colburn Creek Bank, which was owned by a man named Fletcher Adder, who had grown wealthy and powerful in the county on a diet of other people's difficulties. Beale was tall, dressed in the manner of a man who wanted to appear more prosperous than he was, with oiled hair and a silver pocket watch. He consulted more frequently than any situation warranted. He rode up to the Ralston house on a Thursday morning while Luke was replacing the smokehouse door, and his manner when Georgia came out was the manner of a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. Luke kept working, but he listened. Beale told Georgia, with a kind of theatrical regret that sat uneasily on his actual face, that Mr. Adder had reviewed her account and was concerned about her ability to meet the November payment. He told her that Mr. Adder had a generous offer that he hoped she would consider. The bank would forgive the mortgage entirely if Georgia agreed to sell the eastern 40 acres of the property, which happened to include the best water rights on the land, to a cattle concern that Adder was involved with at a price that Beale described as fair, but that was, from where Luke was standing, clearly not. Georgia stood with her arms folded and her hat pulled down against the morning sun, and she said, very quietly and very clearly, "Tell Mr. Adder I will have the mortgage payment by November 15th, as agreed. I have nothing more to say about the eastern acres." Beale smiled the smile of a man who thought he was being patient with a woman who did not understand her situation. "Miss Ralston, I would urge you to think carefully. A woman alone, operating a property this size with a mortgage and a drought year behind her, it is a difficult position." "I am aware of my position," she said. "Good day, Mr. Beale." He left, and she went inside, and Luke finished the smokehouse door and hung it cleanly on its new hinges and tested the seal twice. In the afternoon, when they were both working in the east pasture, checking the irrigation line, he said without preamble, "That eastern 40 with the water rights, that is the heart of the property, is it not?" She glanced at him. "Without the water, the pasture in the south dries up by August and we lose a third of the grazing. The cattle operation falls apart inside 2 seasons. Then Adder knows exactly what he is doing," Luke said. "Yes," she said flatly, "he does." There was a silence, and then she said, "He has been after this land since before my father died. He tried to buy it directly from my father in 1879, and my father told him that he would sooner turn the land to salt than sell it to a man who got rich by waiting for other people to fail." Luke turned that over in his mind. He thought about James Ralston, who he had never met, who had built this place out of nothing and raised his daughter in it and died here in March, and he thought about the particular quality of stubbornness that ran in Georgia Ralston like a vein of iron ore through otherwise common rock. "We have 4 months," he said. "We," she repeated, not questioning it exactly, but noting it. He looked at her directly. "I said I would not leave a job half done." She turned back to the ditch and said nothing more, but the silence was a different kind than before. Over the weeks that followed, Luke threw himself into the work with a single-mindedness that surprised even him. He evaluated the cattle and identified the 12 animals that would not make weight by fall, and he and Georgia agreed on a plan to cull them early and sell to a buyer in Plainview, which brought in $200 that went directly toward materials and supplies. He repaired the loading chute on the east side of the barn, which had been effectively useless for 2 years, making it possible to manage the cattle more efficiently on their own. He planted a late crop of winter squash and turnips in the expanded garden section. Georgia had been planning for 2 seasons, but had not had the hands to execute, and he taught her a clay-pack technique for preserving root vegetables through the summer heat that he had learned from an old farmer in New Mexico. He also fixed the crooked shutter, replaced 3 sections of porch railing, and dug out the crawl space under the southeast corner of the house where rainwater had been pooling and rotting the foundation boards. None of these things were asked for. He simply saw them and did them, and each time Georgia discovered a completed task she had not assigned, she felt the particular confusion of a woman whose careful walls are being taken apart one small brick at a time by someone who is not even making a show of it. They talked more at suppers. Not about weighty things, not at first, but about the land and the cattle and the weather, about the water table and the grass quality and the market prices coming out of Abilene. Georgia knew her operation with a precision that impressed him. She understood not just the immediate problems but the underlying systems, the way the property's productivity was connected to the water, the way the cattle cycles ran against the grass cycles, the way the local market moved. Her father had taught her to think about the land the way a general thinks about a campaign, and she had taken that education and extended it with her own careful intelligence. "You know more about running a cattle operation than some men I have worked for who owned 3 times this acreage," he told her one evening. She looked up from the ledger she was working in. "That is not as much of a compliment as you mean it to be," she said. He grinned, the first full grin he had produced in her presence, and it changed his face in a way that she did not expect. It made him look younger and somehow more solid at the same time, like something that had been braced against trouble and was discovering it could afford to ease slightly. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not. I meant it plainly. You are as smart a rancher as I have ever met." She looked back at the ledger, but the corner of her mouth moved. "Thank you, Luke." It was the first time she had used his name, and they both heard it, and neither of them said anything about it. In the second week of August the rains came. 3 days of steady, gentle rain that soaked into the dry ground like a long drink after a long thirst, and the pasture began to green noticeably, and the creek rose to a healthy level, and the cattle moved to the north pasture, where the grass was coming up thick and good. Luke spent those rainy days on indoor repairs, working on the kitchen floor where 3 boards had developed a dangerous sag, and on the fireplace chimney that had been drawing poorly. He worked steadily while Georgia sat at the kitchen table doing her accounts, and then moved to the parlor to write letters. He could hear her pen moving and occasionally the sound of a chair being pushed back and the rustle of her standing and walking to the window as though she needed to verify that the rain was still falling. On the second rainy afternoon she brought him a cup of coffee where he was working on the kitchen floor and sat down on the wooden chair near the stove and said, "Tell me about Arkansas." He looked up from the floor. "What would you like to know?" "Anything," she said. "I have not been further than Lubbock in 3 years, and I find I have been very short on other people's stories lately." He sat back on his heels and told her about growing up in a small town near Fort Smith, in a family that was large and loud and generally poor, with a father who worked the sawmill and a mother who kept a kitchen garden that fed half the neighborhood. He told her about leaving at 16, which he did without the usual varnish of adventure he had learned to apply to that story, telling her instead that the truth was his father was a hard man in ways that went beyond the acceptable hardness of a hard time, and that leaving was the only sane thing to do. He told her about the years in Colorado, working cattle on the big spreads north of Denver. And about a winter, he had spent up in the mountains helping a Ute family who had found him half frozen and had taken him in and taught him more about reading land and weather than he had learned in all his years before. Georgia listened to all of this with the quality of attention that she brought to everything, full and direct, not looking away to seem polite but actually looking at him. And he found, to his surprise, that he did not feel exposed by it. He felt instead, for the first time in longer than he could accurately name, like someone was actually interested in the particular life he had lived rather than just the particular skills he could provide. He told her about the job in Amarillo that had ended badly, leaving out no part of it, including the fact that it had been his choice to speak up and that he would make the same choice again. She said, "Good, just that. No elaboration. Good." As though it were not a complicated thing at all but a simple one, he looked at her. Most people think it was foolish. Most people confuse foolish with inconvenient, she said, and got up and went back to her accounts, and he sat there for a moment with the coffee getting warm in his hands and something in his chest doing a thing he did not have a word for. September came in hot and dry and busy. The cattle needed moving and sorting and assessing, and there were decisions to be made about which animals to keep through the winter and which to sell in October. Luke and Georgia worked from before dawn until after dark on most days, and on the working days they moved in a kind of practical harmony that required less and less verbal coordination as the weeks went on. He would move to do something, and she would already be accounting for it in her movements. She would start to explain a plan, and find that he had already begun its first step. It was the kind of coordination that takes years to build between people who have worked together, and it was developing between them at a speed that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required talking about things that neither of them was quite ready to address. There was an afternoon in the second week of September when they were working a group of young steers into a sorting pen, and one animal panicked and broke sideways through the rope gate and headed for the open pasture. Luke was on foot and caught the rope first, wrapping it around his forearm, and the steer hit the end of the rope at a full run, and Luke went down hard, dragging through the dirt 6 feet before the animal slowed, and he managed to get his boots under him and stop the pull. He had dirt from his collar to his boots, and a rope burn on his forearm that was raw and red and unhappy, but the steer was stopped. Georgia came through the gate at a controlled run and took the rope from him while he got himself steady, and then she walked the steer back to the pen with a firm hand and a voice like a woman who has been managing frightened animals since she was old enough to hold a rope. She secured the gate and turned around. He was brushing the dirt off his front and examining the rope burn with the casual detachment of a man who has been hurt in more serious ways before and knows this is not one of them. "Come to the house," she said. "It is fine, Georgia." "Come to the house," she said again, and there was no argument in her tone, just a certainty that made arguing feel beside the point. He followed her to the kitchen and sat at the table, and she cleaned the burn with water, and then with a medicine from the cupboard that smelled sharp and herbal, and she wrapped it in a clean strip of cloth with neat, careful hands. She was close to him as she worked, and he could see the concentration in her face, the slight line between her brows and the way she was careful not to press too hard on the burn, and he thought that she was one of the most quietly remarkable people he had ever been within arm's reach of. "Thank you," he said. She tied off the bandage and did not immediately move back, and for a moment they were very close in the kitchen in the mid-September afternoon light coming through the window, and then she stepped back and said, "I need those steers sorted by end of week." "They will be sorted by end of week," he said. She went to the stove and poured water for coffee, and he watched her back and thought about the fact that he was broke and had nothing to offer anyone, and was standing in a kitchen in a borrowed corner of someone else's life, and yet somehow felt more like himself than he had in years. The first moment he understood clearly what was happening to him came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Georgia had gone into town to file some papers at the county office, and Luke had stayed on the property to complete the installation of a new water trough in the north pasture. When she came home, riding up the fork road in the long golden light of early evening, he looked up from where he was standing by the barn and felt something happen in his chest that was not subtle and was not possible to interpret as anything other than what it was. She rode well naturally, as though she and the horse were part of the same idea, and her hat was pushed back slightly from the wind of riding, and her face was tired in the way of someone who had done a full day of hard work, and endured the bureaucratic obstacle of town on top of it. And she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with any conventional idea of beauty, and everything to do with the particular person she was. He did not say any of this. He asked if she had gotten the papers filed, and she said yes and climbed down and handed him the horse's reins while she pulled a parcel from her saddlebag. Inside the parcel, he discovered at supper, were 2 pieces of dried apple pie wrapped in brown paper that she had gotten from Mrs. Hatch at the general store, and she put one in front of him at the table without comment. It was one of the kindest things anyone had done for him in years, and it was a piece of pie. He ate it slowly. October began with a trip to town for the first sale. Luke went with Georgia to walk the buyer through the cattle they had selected, and he watched her negotiate with a directness and a knowledge of market values that she did not apologize for. And the buyer, a broad rancher from down near Sweetwater named Holcomb, who had expected an easy conversation with a woman alone, found himself instead in a straightforward business discussion with someone who knew exactly what her cattle were worth. He paid the price she asked, which was fair and which she had calculated down to the dollar, and as they drove the wagon home along the fork road with the bank draft safe in George's coat pocket, the late afternoon sun turning the dusk golden on the road, she let out a single long breath that she had probably been holding for months. "How close does that put you?" Luke asked. She did the arithmetic in her head, the way she often did, precisely and quickly. "With the October sale proceeds and what we have saved on materials by repairing rather than replacing, I am $240 short of the November payment." He nodded. "The second sale is when?" "October 22nd. I am counting on another 300 from that group if I can get Holcomb back, but he said he was moving south for the winter." "There is a buyer in Plainview," Luke said. "A man named Terrence that I sold to when I was working the Carver place 3 years ago. He pays a reasonable price and he is not in the business of taking advantage." Georgia looked at him. "You know someone in Plainview?" "I know a lot of people in a lot of places," he said. "That is the one advantage of 10 years of drifting." She looked at him for a moment in a way that he could not quite read, and then she looked back at the road. "If you can get word to Terrence by letter, I would be grateful." He wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table while Georgia did her accounts. The act of writing at the same table in the lamplight, the ordinary domestic quiet of it, the way she occasionally read something in her ledger and made a small sound of consideration, or pushed her hair back from her face when she had been working for a long time, was one of the most comfortable things he had experienced in his adult life. He wrote the letter and sealed it and put it in his pocket for the morning post, and he sat for a moment after with his pen down and thought about what he was going to do when November came and the mortgage was paid and the immediate crisis was resolved. He had not considered it directly before because there had always been the next task and the one after that, and the work had been the reason to stay. But the work would eventually reach a maintenance level. The emergency would pass if they managed it, and then there was no particular reason for a broke drifter with nothing to offer to remain on land that belonged to someone else. He did not sleep well that night. The letter reached Terrence in Plainview in 5 days, and his reply came back in 7. He would come to Colburn Creek on the 23rd with his wagon in his hand, and he would look at what Georgia had to offer and pay a fair price. Georgia read the reply twice and then folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer where she kept important papers, and she looked at Luke across the kitchen and said, "How did you know he would come?" "I fixed his barn roof once," Luke said. He told me if I ever needed anything I should write. She shook her head slowly. You are the only person I know who can convert a barn roof into a business contact. I fix things, he said. It tends to generate goodwill. She laughed. It was the first full laugh he had heard from her, genuine and warm and unexpected, and it did something to the room that made everything in it feel slightly different from how it had been before. She pressed her hand over her mouth as though surprised by it herself, and then she let it settle, and she looked at him with her green eyes and smiled, really smiled, and said, "Yes, you certainly do." He looked back at her and there was a beat of silence, a quiet full of something that had been quietly filling for weeks without either of them acknowledging the shape it was taking. And then she stood up and said she was going to check on the cattle, and he said he would come with her, and they walked out into the October evening together, and there was a closeness to the walking that had not always been there. On the night of October 15th, there was a frost. Not a killing frost, but a sharp one, and Luke was up before 4 in the morning, moving the more vulnerable plants in the kitchen garden under the lean-to he had built along the south wall of the house for exactly this purpose. He had built it in August, without being asked, after he had noted in the Almanac Georgia, kept on the kitchen shelf, that the average first frost date for that part of Texas was mid-October, and he had thought about the winter squash and the late tomatoes and the pepper plants that needed a few more weeks to come in fully. Georgia came out at 4:30 and found him carrying the last of the pots under the lean-to's protection, and she stood in the frost-sharp air in her coat and her boots with her breath showing white, and she looked at the lean-to, which she had always understood to be practical, and she looked at him, and something crossed her face that was quiet and deep and entirely unguarded, and she turned away from him and looked out at the frost-silver land and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You built that in August." "I did," he said. "Because of the frost," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for another moment. "You were thinking about October in August." He looked at her profile against the dark sky, which was beginning to go gray at the eastern edge. "I was thinking about this place," he said carefully, "about what it needed." She turned and looked at him directly, and in the cold gray light of that October pre-dawn, he could see that she was working through something significant, working through it with the same precise and honest intelligence she brought to her accounts and her cattle and every other thing that mattered to her. "Luke," she said. "Georgia," he said. And neither of them said anything else for a moment, and then she said, "Come inside. The coffee will be on." Terrence came on the 23rd, and he was a straight-dealing man as promised, a compact, weathered rancher in his 50s who looked at cattle the way a jeweler looks at stones, with practiced certainty about what he was seeing. He and Georgia walked the second selection of cattle together, and he asked good questions, and she answered them fully, and at the end of it, he made an offer that was $350, which was better than Luke had promised and better than Georgia had counted on. She shook his hand and he signed the bill of sale on the back of Luke's wagon, and Terrence loaded his cattle and drove north, and Georgia stood in the yard with the bill of sale and did the arithmetic and looked up and said, "That is the mortgage." Luke felt the relief like water reaching dry ground. "And then some," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. She was not the kind of woman who cried in relief in front of other people, or maybe not in front of anyone, but she looked bright-eyed and more open than he had seen her, with all the months of pressure doing something that looked very much like releasing. "Thank you," she said. It came out simply and entirely. "You did the work," he said. "You did most of it, Georgia. I just fixed some fences." She shook her head slowly. "You came here with 3 cents and you fixed more than fences." They looked at each other in the autumn yard, and the moment had a weight to it, a fullness that neither of them moved to dissolve. A mockingbird went through its long variation from the top of the cottonwood near the creek. The cattle moved in the north pasture. The sky was high and clear and perfect blue, the kind of blue that only comes in October in that part of Texas when the heat has finally relented and the air has a clean edge to it. He said, "Georgia, I need to say something to you." She said, "All right." He said, I came here because I was broke and I needed work and the barman in town told me you needed help. I had no other reason. I want you to know that because I do not want you to think I am a man who pursues things for the wrong reasons." She waited. He said, "I have been here 4 months and I have worked the hardest I have worked in my life and I have not minded a single hour of it. And that is because of the land, which is worth working, and because of the purpose, which is real. But if I am being straight with you, and I have never found any good reason not to be straight with you, it is also because of you, because of who you are." Georgia looked at him for a long time. The mockingbird had stopped. The cattle were still. The world seemed to be waiting for something. "I know," she said quietly. "You know," he repeated. "I have known for a while," she said, "and I have been telling myself that you were leaving, that the mortgage would be paid and you would move on because a man like you does not stay in one place, and there was no reason to allow myself to." She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "My father used to say that the only dishonest thing he ever did in his life was pretend. He was not in love with my mother for 3 months because he thought he was not good enough for her." And she told him afterward that she had known the whole time and had found the 3 months very irritating. Luke felt something in him open like a door he had been leaning against for months. "I am broke," he said. "I know," she said. "I mean I have nothing to offer you in the material sense. I have no land, no savings, no prospects beyond my own 2 hands and what I know how to do with them." "Luke," she said. "Yes. Would you stop listing your deficits and just come here?" He crossed the yard in 4 steps and she met him in the middle of it, and he put his hands on her face, which was warm from the October sun, and she put her hands against his chest, and he kissed her in the yard of her father's land under the October sky, and it was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning but a recognition, the acknowledgement of something that has already been true for a long time. They stood there for a while, not talking, just standing in the yard with his arms around her and her head against his shoulder, and the cattle in the north pasture moved peacefully, and the wind came down from the north with the smell of the coming winter in it. And Luke thought that he had spent 10 years moving away from things, and he was not going to do that anymore. Cord Beale came back in the first week of November, riding up the fork road with his oiled hair and his silver pocket watch, and his manner of theatrical regret. Georgia had the mortgage payment ready, the full amount, counted out in banknotes and certified through the Plainview Bank at Luke's suggestion, because he did not trust a document that passed through Fletcher Adder's hands without independent verification. She held the envelope out to Beale before he had finished his second sentence. Beale looked at the envelope. He looked at Georgia. He looked at Luke, who was standing near the barn door with his arms crossed, not making any kind of threat, just being present in a way that certain men are present when they want to make it clear that the conversation has an audience. "That is the full payment," Georgia said, "with 3 weeks to spare. I would like a receipt dated today and a confirmation through the county recorder that the mortgage is current." Beale took the envelope and opened it and counted the money, and his face went through several transitions, settling finally on the expression of a man who has failed at something he did not expect to fail at and is deciding how to wear that. "Mr. Adder will want to discuss the property going forward," Beale said. "Mr. Adder is welcome to discuss the weather with me in town," Georgia said. "He is not welcome to discuss this property because it is not his concern. The mortgage will be paid off in full over its remaining term as agreed. There is nothing further to negotiate." Beale left and Georgia watched him go, and Luke watched her watch him go, and when the dust of the road had settled, she turned around and her expression was the expression of a woman who has just completed a long fight. "That felt good," she said. "It looked like it did," Luke said. She walked to him and he met her and she put her face against his neck and he held her and she let the tension out of her shoulders and her back in a long, quiet exhale. He held her and felt the particular quality of relief that is not just the absence of danger but the presence of safety, and he thought that he had not felt this in a very long time, if ever. In the evenings now, they sat together after supper, and the sitting was different than before. Not the careful parallel sitting of two people being practical in each other's vicinity, but the close and easy sitting of people who have stopped pretending they are not glad of the nearness. He taught her to play a card game he had learned in Colorado, and she beat him with the particular efficiency of someone who only needs to be shown a thing once. She read aloud from a collection of poems her father had owned that she had not opened since March, and he listened and watched her face while she read, which was a different kind of reading altogether. One evening, she played the small, upright piano in the parlor that had been silent since her father's death, working through a hymn her mother had taught her, rustily at first and then with more confidence, and the sound of it filling the house made something settle in the rooms that had been unsettled. He had been sleeping in the barn since the beginning, and this arrangement, which had been entirely appropriate and which neither of them had questioned, began to feel, in the November cold, like a kind of politeness that had served its purpose. He did not say this. But one evening when the temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind was coming under the barn door with a purposeful cold, Georgia knocked on the barn door at 9 in the evening, and said that there was a room in the house, the room that had been used for storage, that he could have if he chose, with a proper bed and a door that sealed against the weather, and it was impractical for him to be sleeping in a barn in November when there was a heated house 20 yards away. He thanked her and moved his things in the next morning, and the room was small and warm and had a window that looked east, toward the creek and the cottonwood, and he lay in the bed that first night and listened to the house breathing around him, the settle of the timbers and the tick of the stove cooling and the wind outside, and he thought about the conversation he needed to have with Georgia before the end of the year. He had been thinking about it for weeks. Not in the way of a man talking himself into something, but in the way of a man working toward a clarity that has been approaching for a long time and is now close enough to touch. He asked her on a Wednesday evening in late November, the first real cold of the season having settled in, with the fire going in the kitchen stove and the lamplight warm and steady on the table. She was darning a pair of his work socks, which was an intimacy they had not discussed but which had simply happened one evening when she sat down with her darning basket and picked up a sock from the pile of mending and added his to it without comment. He said, "Georgia." She looked up. He said, "I need to ask you something and I want to ask it honestly, which means I need to say some things first." She put the darning down. She gave him her full attention, which she always did, and it still did the same thing to him every time. He said, "I came here broke and I agreed to work without wages because I had no choice, and you gave me a chance without any reason to trust me, and that was a generous thing. I have worked here for 5 months, and I still do not have money in the conventional sense, though I have earned something in your keeping of the books that I know and you know is the equivalent of a fair wage. I am not a wealthy man, and I am not going to be a wealthy man in the short term, and I want to be honest about that." She said, "I have never asked you to be wealthy." He said, "No, you have not. What I am asking you to consider is whether you would want me here not just as a man who works the land, but as a man who is part of it, whether you would consider marrying me, Georgia." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire ticked. The wind moved around the house. He sat with the question out in the air between them and did not try to add to it or qualify it or take it back. She said, "I have been running this property alone for 9 months, and in that time I have been afraid precisely once." He waited. She said, "I was afraid the morning you told me you did not want wages, and I said fine, because I thought, what do I do if he leaves? And then I thought, what a strange thing to be afraid of in the context of a man you have known for 10 minutes. And then I thought that it was not strange at all, that some people tell you who they are very quickly if you have the sense to listen." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That is a yes, Luke." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat there for a long time in the warm kitchen in the November night, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. They were married in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, in the small church in Colburn Creek with the crooked steeple that the new bell had not managed to straighten. The preacher was a young man named Aldrich who was earnest and kind, and slightly overwhelmed by Georgia Ralston's composure, and the witnesses were Mrs. Hatch from the general store, who had taken a maternal interest in Georgia's situation that she expressed primarily through dried apple pie, and a man named Clay Hinson, who was the closest neighbor in the other direction from the Harper place, and who had come to regard Luke with the particular warmth of a man who has watched someone else do a difficult thing well. Georgia wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, a cream-colored wool that was simple and beautifully constructed, and suited her with the same practical elegance that everything about her had. Luke wore his best clothes, which were modest, and he had purchased a new hat in town, because the old one had finally given up its structural integrity after 5 months of hard use. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk up the aisle, and felt the particular stillness of a man whose life has just arrived at its center. They exchanged vows in the plain language of the time and place, and the preacher pronounced them married, and they rode home along the fork road in the cold December afternoon, Georgia in the wagon beside him, her shoulder against his, and the land around them bare and clean and waiting for spring. The winter was hard but good. Cold in the way of Texas winters in that part of the Panhandle, which is to say it came in fast and went deep and stayed. The cattle needed daily attention, and Luke and Georgia worked through it together with the ease of people who have already proven they can do difficult things side by side. He fixed the drafts in the house, adding chinking to the north wall where cold air had been finding its way in, and built a second storage shed for firewood. She taught him her method of reading the cattle for early illness, which was a skill that combined intuitive observation with systematic checking in a way that impressed him deeply. On winter evenings, they read together by the fire, sharing books from the small shelf in the parlor that represented James Ralston's taste for practical literature, history, and the occasional novel. They talked about the land and what it could become. Luke had ideas about expanding the operation gradually, not dramatically but sensibly, adding perhaps 20 head in the spring if the market held, and he had been thinking about a small hay operation that would reduce their dependence on outside feed in hard winters. Georgia had been thinking about the same thing from a different angle, and they spent one long evening in January working it out together, passing the paper back and forth across the kitchen table. It was a Tuesday evening in February, 8 weeks after the wedding, when Georgia told him something with a kind of careful casualness that fooled neither of them. She said, "I should probably mention that I believe there will be an addition to this household by the autumn." He looked at her across the table. She met his eyes, and there was a softness in her face that she allowed, not unguardedly, but with the deliberateness of a woman who has decided that certain things are worth the vulnerability. He got up from the table and came around to her and knelt by her chair, which was not his most characteristic gesture, being a man who generally expressed emotion through action rather than posture, but which was entirely right for the moment, and took both her hands in his. He said, "Georgia Donovan." She said, he said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well. I am tired in the mornings and I suspect that will continue for a while, but I am well." He said, "Tell me what you need." She said, "I need you to not treat me like I am made of glass, because I am not made of glass and I have a hay operation to plan and 63 head of cattle to see through the winter." He laughed and kissed her hands and said, "All right," she said, "but you can make the coffee in the mornings. The smell of it is difficult right now." He made the coffee in the mornings from that point forward, carrying her cup to wherever she was working and leaving it where she could find it when she was ready for it. And she appreciated this without saying so, because they had developed by then the language of practical people who show love primarily in the doing of small, careful things for each other. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in that part of Texas, the grass greening up seemingly overnight and the creek running fresh and the air losing its hard winter edge. The cattle moved to the north pasture, and the hay field that Luke and Georgia had planned over the winter was broken ground and seeded by the first week of April. A 10-acre section along the east pasture that had good water from the creek and good sun, and they tended it with the same attention they brought to everything. Georgia continued to work the property through her pregnancy with the same determination she brought to everything else, modifying where necessary but not retreating from the work. Luke was near her for every hour of the working day, and the modification of tasks, when it happened, was handled between them with such matter-of-fact practicality that it felt less like accommodation and more like the natural adjustment of two people who have learned to work as one unit. In May, Cord Beale appeared for the last time. He rode up the fork road looking somewhat diminished, his oiled hair not quite as oiled and his manner not quite as theatrical, and he conveyed the information that Mr. Adder was prepared to make a final offer on the eastern 40 acres, an offer substantially improved from the previous ones. Luke was in the yard when he arrived, and he said, politely and directly, "Mr. Beale, Mrs. Donovan and I are not selling any portion of this property, and we will not be doing so. The mortgage will continue to be paid as agreed, and we do not expect to hear from Mr. Adder or his representatives on this matter again." Beale looked at him. He looked at the property, which was in considerably better condition than it had been the last time he had seen it, with new fencing along the west and the hay field green and promising in the east, and the barn solid on its repaired roof. He looked at the way Luke was standing, which was easy and certain, the stance of a man who is standing on ground that is his in every way that matters. Beale nodded once and rode away, and they never heard from Fletcher Adder again. In June, Clay Hinson brought his wife over for supper, and it was the first social evening the Donovans had hosted, and Georgia cooked a beef roast that filled the house with the kind of smell that makes people grateful to be alive, and they sat around the kitchen table and talked well into the evening about cattle and weather and the railroad coming through and the future of the county. Luke watched Georgia talk across the table, animated and sharp and warm in ways that she had not always been warm in the early months, and he felt a quiet pride that was not about possession, but about witness, about the particular satisfaction of seeing someone who deserves good things in the middle of having them. Clay Hinson said, on the way out that evening, to Luke at the door while their wives were saying goodbye in the kitchen, "You know, there was a fair amount of doubt in town when you showed up here. A broke drifter offering to work without wages, people thought she was being taken advantage of." Luke said, "What do people think now?" Hinson grinned. "I think most people have the sense by now to know that she is the one who got the better of that arrangement." Luke thought about this on the way back to the kitchen, where Georgia was cleaning up the supper dishes with the practical efficiency she brought to everything. He thought about the fact that she had said fine to a stranger with 3 cents and a worn-out saddle, and that the work he had found in this place, the actual work that had been worth more than any wage he had ever collected, was not the fencing and the roofing and the cattle and the hay. It was this house and this woman and the life that had been built inside the plain hard fact of honest work done together. He came into the kitchen and stood beside her, and she handed him a dish to dry without looking up, and he dried it and set it on the shelf, and she handed him the next one, and they finished the dishes together, and she dried her hands and turned and leaned against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the warm kitchen in the June night and listened to the night sounds coming through the open window, the creek and the frogs and the cattle in the distant north pasture. "Clay said something about me," he said. "What did he say?" "He said you got the better of the arrangement." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He is not wrong." He looked down at her. She looked up at him with those green eyes that had been taking his measure since August of last year and had apparently found the results acceptable. "Georgia," he said. "Luke," she said. "I'm never going to be a wealthy man," he said. She said, "You have said that before." He said, "I just want to make sure you continue to know it." She said, "I grew up on this land. My father built this house with borrowed money and sheer stubbornness. I have never been particularly interested in wealthy men." She put her hand on his chest. "I am very interested in this one." He kissed her and she kissed him back, and the house held them both, the way good houses hold the people who have sweated and fought and loved inside them. And outside, the Texas night went on being enormous and indifferent and beautiful. Their son was born in October, on a Tuesday, with Dr. Finch from Colburn Creek in attendance and Clay Hinson's wife, whose name was Nora and who had become Georgia's closest friend in the county, serving as support and practical assistance. Luke was not permitted in the room, which was the custom of the time, and he spent 4 of the most unproductive hours of his life sitting on the porch with his hat in his hands doing absolutely nothing useful, which was not a state he was accustomed to and which he found extremely difficult. When Nora Hinson came to the door and told him he had a son, he stood up so fast the porch chair tipped backward. The boy was small and red, and had a quantity of dark hair and an expression of considerable displeasure at his situation, which Luke privately thought suggested sound judgment, given that the world he had entered was not without its difficulties. Georgia was tired and flushed and entirely herself, holding the baby with the careful competence that she brought to everything she handled, and when Luke came in and knelt by the bed she looked up at him with an expression he had no adequate word for. It was love and exhaustion and pride and something that was bigger than any of those things separately. He touched the baby's head gently and said, "He is perfect." Georgia said, "He is extremely loud." Luke laughed and pressed his forehead to hers, and she closed her eyes for a moment and they stayed like that. And outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwood by the creek, and the cattle moved in the north pasture, and the hay field had come in beautifully in its first season, and the mortgage had been paid, and the eastern 40 acres with the water rights was still firmly attached to the rest of the land where it belonged. They named the boy James, after George's father, and the name sat right in the house the first time they said it aloud in the kitchen, the way some names are immediately true. James Donovan was a good baby in the way that healthy babies are good, which is to say he slept enough and ate enough, and announced his dissatisfactions in the large and earnest voice of a person who expects to be taken seriously. He was carried around the property from the earliest weeks in the manner of a ranch child, his father holding him in one arm while using the other to check a fence line or examine the hay, his mother talking to him about the land with the same directness she used with everyone else. He absorbed the smell of horses and grass and timber, and turned into a boy who was, as they had suspected from the beginning, going to have a great deal of his mother in him. By the following spring, the Donovan operation had expanded as planned, adding 23 head to the herd and extending the hay field by another 6 acres. Luke had gotten word through an acquaintance in Plainview that a neighboring property of 40 acres along the North Road was coming available at a price that was within reach, and he and Georgia spent a January evening going over the numbers, and decided it was manageable and bought it in February, adding it to the east side of their own land, and doubling their water access from the secondary creek that ran through the new section. The night they signed the papers, Georgia sat at the kitchen table and looked at the deed with her name and Luke's name on it, and she said quietly, "My father would have liked this." Luke said, "I think he would have." She said, "He would have liked you." "I hope so," he said. She said, "He liked straight-talking men who worked hard and didn't make a show of it. He would have liked you very much." She folded the deed and put it in the desk drawer with the other important papers, next to the letter Terence had written the year before, and the receipt from the mortgage payment, and the deed to the original land, a collection of documents that told the story of a place that had been fought for and held, and was going to continue to be held. James learned to walk in the spring, with the aggressive determination of a child who has decided the current arrangement of being carried everywhere is no longer adequate to his ambitions. He walked across the kitchen floor and then across the yard, and then made an immediate attempt on the barn, where he had developed a deep interest in Pella, who tolerated his attentions with the patient wisdom of an old mare who has seen a great deal. 2 springs later, in 1884, Georgia told Luke at the kitchen table on an April evening, with James now a sturdy and opinionated 2-year-old asleep in his room, that there would be a second addition to the household by the autumn. Luke said, "How are you feeling in the mornings?" she said. "The coffee smell is difficult again." He nodded and said, "I will handle the morning coffee." She said, "You are very reliable about the coffee." He said, "I am very reliable about everything." She looked at him across the table with her green eyes that were the same eyes they had always been, exact and honest and capable of the full range of warmth that she had, at the beginning, kept very carefully under practical control. She said, "Yes, you are." The second child was a girl, born in October as her brother had been, as though the Donovan children had collectively decided that October was the appropriate month and were sticking to the arrangement. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's copper-colored eyes, and she arrived in the world with considerably less drama than her brother had, and went to sleep almost immediately, which suggested either a very easy temperament or a profound strategy. They named her Ada, after Georgia's mother, whose name had been said in this house too infrequently in too many years, and the name was immediately right the same way James had been immediately right, settling into the house and the family like something that had always been meant to be there. James was very interested in Ada in the manner of a 2-year-old encountering something new and uncertain, circling her at a cautious distance and making occasional investigative approaches. By the end of the first week, he had accepted her presence, and by the end of the second had become proprietary about her in a way that made Georgia laugh and Luke nod with the recognition of a man who understands that once a Donovan decides something is theirs, they are thorough about it. Colburn Creek grew around them in the years that followed, the way small towns in that part of Texas grew in the 1880s, unevenly and with occasional setbacks, but on the whole forward. The railroad came through in 1885, connecting the county to the larger markets in a way that benefited the Donovan operation directly, and Luke arranged a contract through a cattle buyer out of Fort Worth for a portion of their annual herd sale that stabilized their income in ways the previous year-to-year uncertainty had not. Fletcher Adder's bank changed hands in 1885, bought out by a larger concern from Dallas after a series of loans that went badly, and Cord Beale was not part of the new arrangement. Luke heard this from Clay Hinson at the hardware store one Saturday and told Georgia that evening, and she received the information with a quiet satisfaction that she expressed by putting an extra piece of pie in front of him at supper. He ate it and said, "Is that a commentary on the news?" She said, "That is just a piece of pie." He said, "I appreciate it either way." She said, "I know you do." The Donovan land was paid off entirely by the spring of 1886. The mortgage cleared in its final installment, with the proceeds from the previous fall's cattle sale, plus the hay contract that Luke had been building for 3 years into a reliable secondary income. Georgia made the last payment herself, driving the wagon into Colburn Creek on a March morning with Luke beside her and James, who was 4 now and had opinions about everything, sitting between them asking questions about every building they passed. She came out of the bank with the receipt and the discharge of lien, which was the legal document confirming that the land was fully free and clear, and she stood on the boardwalk in the March light and looked at the paper, and Luke watched her face. She folded it very carefully and put it inside her coat against her heart, which was not a gesture he expected from her, and she looked up at him and her eyes were bright, the same bright he had seen the day Terence came and bought the second group of cattle, but deeper now, with more years in it, more weight and more meaning. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. James said, "Can we go to the general store? Mrs. Hatch has penny candy." They both looked at their son, who was looking at them with the expectation of a child who considers his own priorities perfectly reasonable, which they were. Luke said, "Yes, we can go to the general store." Georgia took James's hand and Luke walked beside her along the Colburn Creek boardwalk in the March sun, and they went to the general store, and Mrs. Hatch, who was older now but entirely herself, gave James a penny candy and looked at Georgia and said, "You look like a woman who just did something that needed doing." Georgia said, "We paid the land off this morning." Mrs. Hatch said, "Well," in a tone that contained about 40 years of frontier woman understanding, and then she said, "Good. Your father would have been very pleased." "Yes," Georgia said, "he would." They drove home along the fork road in the March afternoon with James asleep between them, his head on Luke's knee, having used up his considerable energy on the penny candy and the investigation of every item in the general store. The cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to bud, that particular green that only happens in early spring, and the land was opening up toward another season with the same stubborn and reliable intention it always had. Georgia said, "I keep thinking about what that looked like, you riding in with 3 cents and a saddle that was more hope than leather." Luke said, "It was holding together," she said, "barely." He said, "I had Pella in good condition." "That was the important thing," she smiled. "Yes, I noticed the horse." He said, "And you said fine," she said, "and you found out the work was worth more than money." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them their son slept with the total and untroubled sleep of a child who has never had reason to be afraid of where he is. Luke said, "Worth considerably more." She put her hand through his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and they drove home along the fork road with the buds on the cottonwoods, and the cattle on the green hill and the land before them, completely and entirely theirs. That evening, after supper, after James had been put to bed with the story about the horse that could count that he had requested for the 14th consecutive evening, and which Luke had by now refined into an ongoing serial of considerable narrative complexity, and after Ada had been nursed and settled in her cradle, and after the kitchen had been cleaned and the fire banked, Georgia and Luke sat on the porch in the cool March evening, close together under a wool blanket because the nights were still cold, and looked out at the land. The stars were extraordinary, the way they are in that part of Texas far from any city, so thick and numerous that the sky seems to lean down toward you with the weight of all that light. The creek made its small sound in the dark. An owl went through the big cottonwood and was gone. The cattle were invisible in the dark pasture but present, the way good things are present even when you cannot see them. Georgia said, "When I told you fine that morning on the porch, I was being practical." "I was being completely practical," he said. "I know," she said. "I want you to know that I understand now that it was the least practical decision I ever made." He said, "Is that so?" She said, "Because practical decisions are about what you need in the immediate term, and what I needed in the immediate term was fence work and a barn roof." She paused. "But that was not all that came with you." He turned his head to look at her profile in the starlight. She was looking out at the land, at the dark shapes of the hills to the north and the glitter of the creek and the enormous quiet of the Texas night, and her face had the expression of a woman who is entirely at home in the place she is. He said, "Georgia," she said. He said, "I did not have a single thing in the world when I came up that road. Not a dollar, not a plan, not a reason to be anywhere in particular." She said, "No," he said, "and now I have more than I have ever had or thought I would have." She turned and looked at him. "The land," she said, "not a question, not a limit, just an acknowledgement of everything the word contained." He said, "The land, yes, and you, and James, and Ada, and this porch and this night and all the mornings to come." She looked at him for a long moment with her green eyes that had been reading him honestly since the beginning, since the morning he rode down from the rise and she came out of the house with a rifle on her back and a look that said she was nobody's soft option. She said, "You came here broke, Luke Donovan." He said, "I did." She said, "You are still not a wealthy man." He said, "No, I am not," she said, "but I think you understand now that the work was worth more than wages." He said, "I understood that some time before November, Georgia." She laughed softly in the dark, that warm, unexpected laugh that had always done something to whatever room she was in, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the blanket settled around both of them, and the stars went on being astronomical and indifferent and beautiful, and the land breathed around them in the March night, and the house behind them held their sleeping children, and the creek ran clean to the east where the water rights were still intact and were going to remain intact, and the fences held on all four sides of the property, and the hay field was ready for another season, and the mortgage was gone and the deed was free, and the name on it was Donovan, which meant both of them and all of it. They sat there for a long time, long after the night deepened and the temperature dropped and the stars began to turn slowly toward morning, and neither of them was in any hurry to go inside, because the inside would be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, and for the moment they were content to be exactly where they were. Eventually Georgia said, against his shoulder, "We should sleep. James will be up before the sun." Luke said, "He will, yes." Georgia said, "And he will want the story about the horse that counts." Luke said, "I am developing a theory that the horse is about to discover a treasure." Georgia said, "He will be very pleased about that." Luke said, "I thought so." She stood up and took his hand and they went inside, and Luke pulled the porch door shut against the March night, and the lamp in the kitchen made a warm square of light in the dark of the house, and upstairs James Donovan slept in his bed dreaming of whatever a 4-year-old dreams of who has grown up on a piece of land that his parents fought hard to keep and won. And in her cradle Ada slept with the total composure of a child who has been named after someone who was loved. And in the kitchen Georgia Donovan turned down the lamp and took her husband's hand and they went to their room. And outside the fork road lay quiet and empty under the stars, and the land was still, and all the things that had been broken were fixed, and all the things that had been uncertain were settled, and the morning would come early and full of work and they would both be there for it, as they had been every morning and would be every morning to come. The troubled Luke Donovan had ridden into Colburn Creek in 1882 with 3 cents and a worn-out saddle, and nothing to offer but honest labor had turned into the most valuable transaction of his life. He had offered to work without wages, and Georgia Ralston had said fine. And what he had found, in the weeks and months and years that followed, was that the work had paid him in things that no wage ever could. It had paid him in purpose and in home, and in the particular richness of a life built shoulder to shoulder with someone who is your equal in every way that matters. It had paid him in the sound of his children sleeping, and in the weight of a deed with his name on it, and in the smell of the hay field in June, and in the feel of Georgia's hand in his in the dark of a March night on a porch that belonged to both of them. He had come to this land with nothing and the land had given him everything, and he had not made that trade. He had simply shown up and been honest and done the work, and the rest had happened because some things, when they are true, do not require management or strategy. They only require the courage to say yes when the moment comes, or in this case, the simple and complete word that Georgia Ralston had said on a porch in August of 1882 to a man with 3 cents and a worn-out saddle and honest hands. Fine, just fine, which turned out to be exactly enough.